Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we are going to be going through the studio discography of the British group Slowdive, another amazing band to make some very significant contributions to the world of shoegaze and dream pop music throughout the 90s, and another group that took a pretty long hiatus and surprised us with the return album after an over 20-year break, and we've seen that happen with multiple other groups that are in their orbit with bands like Swervedriver, Ride, and My Bloody Valentine. And I think that it pretty clearly demonstrates that shoegaze and dream pop have aged very well, and there is clearly still a thriving market and fan base for this music. And with the release of their recent 5th studio album, I figured this would be a perfect time to go through their discography. So what I'm going to do today is go through their 5 studio albums, starting with Just for a Day and going up to Everything is Alive, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 5 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut studio album from 1991 titled Just for a Day, and I will give this an A. I really enjoy this record. I wouldn't say it's their best release, but for a debut album, there is a lot of stuff that I really enjoy about this. Prior to releasing this, they had already recorded 3 EPs, and when they had gone into the studio to record this record, they had nothing written and started pretty much from a blank slate and wrote this entire album over the course of 6 weeks. So it was recorded in a somewhat rushed fashion, but all things considered, I think they managed to produce a very enjoyable album. Stylistically, this one is sort of a fusion of shoegaze, dream pop, and gothic rock, with much more of a raw production style than any of their other releases. It's got 9 tracks on here, all written by Neil Halstead, and I do find the majority of the songs on here very enjoyable. It opens up with Spanish Air, which kicks things off on more of a dreary and dark sort of mood, and it's a 6-minute song that really takes its time and vibes out for a while. And then the follow-up track, Celia's Dream, takes us in a more euphoric, dream pop sort of mood. A very beautiful song, and definitely one of my favorites on here. After that, we have Catch the Breeze, which takes on more of that dreary sort of mood that we got from the opening track. And this was also a song that had already been released on a previous EP titled Holding Our Breath, and it was also the only single from this album. I really love the use of dynamics on this one between the 2 main sections. When that second section comes in, it's just got that classic layered and massive shoegaze sound that I love so much. Then we go into Ballad of Sister Sue, which is the first track to feature Rachel Goswell on the lead vocal part. Another one more in that dreary and sad sort of mood. And in general, I would say that that's a mood that I typically associate with this album, kind of sad and bleak, which is certainly not a bad thing. I listen to tons of music that give off that mood, and when I'm in the right headspace for it, this can be a very enjoyable album for putting me in that frame of mind. After that, we mix things up a bit with an instrumental ambient track titled Eric's Song, which features layered guitars with tons of reverb, and it creates a very nice chill and atmospheric vibe. A really nice track to place in the midpoint of the album. And then after that, we have Waves, which is a very pretty song. Another one that's a little more upbeat and more in that dream pop sort of realm, similar to Celia's Dream. And I think stylistically, the couple of tracks that they place on this album that are in this sort of mood do a really good job of balancing out the more sadder sounding tracks. This would definitely be one of my favorite tracks on here. And then we continue with Brighter, which would be my favorite song on here to have Rachel on lead vocals. A very pretty and dreamy song, and I really love Rachel and Neil's harmonies for the chorus. I think the pairing of the 2 of them really produces some very magical sounds whenever they do the octave layers or the vocal harmonies. Just a very great vocal pairing. Then the album continues with The Sad Man, which is an interesting song that has minimal percussion and is much more guitar and bass centered, but still builds nicely with some distortion getting introduced in certain parts. Another very dreamy song that has always given me hints of Julie Cruz, who did a lot of of the music on Twin Peaks, which is obviously a very good thing. And then the album concludes with a track titled Primal, another one that's more in that dream pop realm with a very hopeful sounding vocal melody for the verse, and then a much sadder sounding chorus. Really nice contrasting moods from section to section, and another one that has beautiful vocal doublings in octaves between Rachel and Neil. And the final section just has such great and intense dynamics to it, and it just wraps up this album in a very satisfying way. So all in all, I think this is a really solid first release. It doesn't have any songs that I dislike, but at the same time, I don't know if any of the tracks on here would make my top 10 favorite Slowdive song list. The only possible exception might be Waves, but other than that, I think that would probably be the only one. But regardless of that, I really enjoy what they did on here. Like I said, with the raw production and some of the gothic rock elements, it does have more of that sad and dreary sort of mood, much more so than any of their other albums, so it is a record that I do have to be in a particular mood to listen to, and I don't find myself going back to it as much as some of their other records, but when I'm in the right mood, this can be a very enjoyable experience. So a solid first release, this one gets an A. Alright, next we have their second studio album from 1992 titled Souvlaki, and no big surprise here, this one gets an easy S. Absolutely incredible album, my favorite Slowdive album, as is the case with so many other people, and this is a record that is considered one of the top albums of the shoegaze and dream pop genre, and I definitely agree with that sentiment. And I feel like this album is a gateway into Slowdive for a lot of people. It was for me. Years ago when I had started exploring shoegaze more, all it took was a simple Google search of the top shoegaze albums of all time, and you will see this one pop up time and time again, and that's how I found out about them. And as soon as I heard this record, I was hooked right from the beginning and completely intrigued and wanted to check out all of their other stuff. This one is a significant improvement from the first release in terms of the production and the songwriting. I didn't dislike the songwriting from the first album, but I think that this album contains some seriously exceptional songs, and for me personally, it contains the largest amount of my favorite Slowdive songs all on one album. A couple of noteworthy things to mention about this record is that they initially contacted Brian Eno asking him to produce this record, and he declined and said that he would rather collaborate than produce. So he co-wrote one track on here and also contributed keyboards to another, and I think it would have been very interesting to see how different this album would have been under the direction of Brian Eno, especially considering the fact that I don't think that he ever produced any album that was in the shoegaze realm, so it could have drastically changed the way this album came out. Another noteworthy thing about this album, and I actually forgot to mention this on the previous record, but at the start of the group, Neil and Rachel had been romantically involved, and they had actually broken up prior to the writing process for this record, which resulted in them writing more songs on their own, but the majority of the tracks on here did end up being written by Neil. The album has 10 tracks, and from front to back, they do not waste a beat. I think every song on here is incredible. Opening up with Allison, which is a Slowdive classic, and easily one of my favorite Slowdive songs. And when I initially heard this album for the first time, I don't think that they could have opened this up with a better song, because as soon as I heard that opening guitar part and then the vocals came in, I was just completely in, and they had me from that point on. The chorus, again, has those beautiful octave vocal parts between Rachel and Neil, which is just so beautiful. And then that is followed up by Machine Gun, which brings the tempo down slightly and gives us a really pretty mid-tempo sort of ballad with Rachel and Neil alternating vocal parts very nicely. A great follow-up track, and then we have another favorite of mine titled 40 Days. I absolutely love the chord progression on this one, and Neil's really low vocal parts are just so cool and so vibey. I love the distorted guitar parts that come in after the chorus as well. Then we bring the tempo down with more of a stripped down track titled Sing, which features Rachel on vocals, and this is also the song that Brian Eno co-wrote with them. A nice little change of pace from the fuller instrumentation of the opening 3 tracks. This one also features some interesting background ambient sounds as well, which sort of serves as a precursor for sounds that they would continue to explore more on their next album. Then we have Here She Comes, which has some of my favorite guitar work of this entire album. Really great two-part guitar writing and very colorful chord movements. Another one with beautiful low vocals from Neil, and a similar stripped-down style to the track before it. Then we have another classic from this album, Souvlaki Space Station. Such an awesome song to just vibe out to. A really great set of chords in the guitar, a nice driving bass line, and really lush and reverb-laden vocal melodies from Rachel. The perfect little pick-me-up track after the previous two more mellow and stripped-down songs. Then we have another favorite of mine on here, When the Sun Hits. Such an incredible song with great vocal melodies from Neil. Really cool two-part guitar writing. I love the harmonics and the incredible use of dynamics. The change in energy between the two main sections is so intense and powerful. Just a perfect song. And then we change gears and go back into a more mellow mood with All Together, a really chill and dreamy track that contrasts the previous two tracks very nicely. Then that is followed by Melon Yellow, which has more of an ambient vibe to it with some reversed samples happening over the guitar and drum groove that eventually builds into this really washy, distorted guitar part with these beautiful vocal harmonies on top of it. A super euphoric song that sets up the closing track very nicely, which is Dagger. And this was one of the tracks that Neil had written by himself, which was commenting on the breakup and his thoughts surrounding that. Opening up with acoustic guitar, which is a nice little unexpected change of instrumentation, and it's got Neil on vocals. And unlike the closer on Just for a Day, this one kind of maintains a similar energy throughout and doesn't contain any really heavy or intense sections where the drums come in like we heard on the closing track from Just for a Day. But I like that, and I think this is a very tasteful way to wrap up this incredible album. And I think from track to track, they do an amazing job of mixing up the mood and energy with some songs that are more high energy and a couple that are more chill and stripped down, but it's all packaged in a way that feels very cohesive, and the flow from song to song is great. And like I said, I think the production is far better on this one as well. Everything sounds so crisp, and the layers just give us those classic dream pop and shoegaze sounds that we all know and love. And yeah, I just cannot say enough good things about this record. An incredible album, definitely a contender for my top 5 favorite shoegaze records, and my number 1 favorite Slowdive album. So this one gets an easy S. Alright, moving on, we have their third studio album from 1995 titled Pygmalion, and I will give this one an A. A very enjoyable album, and also very interesting from a stylistic perspective. A big shift in sound from what we heard on Souvlaki. So after the release of Souvlaki, they would put out an EP titled 5, which saw their sound veer off into a more electronic and ambient territory, and that would serve as somewhat of a precursor as to where they were going to go with this album, with this one taking on a more ambient flavor but also incorporating some elements of post-rock as well. The album has 9 tracks, and 7 of them were written by Neil, and 2 of them were written by Neil and Rachel, and a lot of the songs on here feature lots of guitar loops and grooves and textures that really take their time and build these beautiful vibes and atmospheres. The opening track, titled Rudy, kicks off the album with a 10-minute, really vibey song that takes its time with guitar layers and reverb-laden vocal parts. I really love this song. I think it opens up the album in such a cool way and really differentiates itself from Souvlaki, where on that record they hit you with Allison, which kicks off the album right away with a nice burst of energy, whereas with this one it really builds and takes its time. Track 2, titled Crazy For You, gives us similar layering with some looped guitar parts and vocal lines with delay. This one is a bit of a faster tempo compared to the opener, so it's a little more energetic, but also still stretches out and really takes its time at 6 minutes in length. Then we have Miranda, which gives us a more dark and dreary acoustic track with Rachel on vocals. This one has some really haunting properties to it that I love so much. I always felt like this song could work great for a horror movie because there are some truly eerie sounds that are produced throughout this track. Honestly, it's probably my favorite song on this album, too. After that, we have Trellisaz. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, so apologies if not. But this one goes into more of that experimental post-rock territory with all sorts of interesting sounds and textures going on. This would probably be my least favorite track on here if I had to pick one. Sometimes this one can feel a little too chaotic for me, but I know that some people love that style. Then we continue with Cello, which is a 94-second instrumental track that's very ambient and spacey. A nice little transitional track to set up the last leg of the album, which starts out with Jay's Heaven, another slow-paced song with minimal percussion that takes its time at almost 7 minutes in length, with tons of reverb on the vocals and all sorts of layers and textures on top of it. Then that is followed by another short track titled Visions of LA, which consists of just acoustic guitars and Rachel on vocals. A very pretty song that changes things up very nicely and gives us a nice little break from the massive amounts of sound that we had been hit with up to this point. Then we have Blue Skied and Clear, which is a really nice chill and dreamy track that I would say is probably the most feel-good song of the album, and it's placed in a great spot and sets up the final track very nicely, which is titled All of Us. Another one that is very spacey and acoustic guitar centered with Neil on vocals and some very pretty string backgrounds that add such a nice additional layer to the sound. And I like how on here we get Rachel's acoustic track with Visions of LA, and now we get Neil's acoustic track with this closing song. And given the vibe of this album, I think this song was a very appropriate track to conclude the record on, keeping that very chill and ambient vibe with tons of reverb and lush vocal melodies and chord progressions. So in general, I really enjoy this album, and I will say that because of how chill and how vibey it is, it's definitely another one of those records where I do need to be in a specific mood to listen to it, similar to Just for a Day, but for different reasons. But if I'm in the right mood, this album can be a very enjoyable experience. I think the majority of the songs on here are very good. I love the experimentation with loops and different kind of effects. I think the production is top-notch, and it's great hearing them venture out into some more of those post-rock territories and showing us some different sides to their sound. So I do understand why this album is not for everybody, and it certainly does not sound like Souvlaki, so I can understand why some people might not be the biggest fan of it. But for me personally, I do really enjoy it, and it definitely produced a good handful of really solid Slowdive songs. So a really good album. I will give this one an A. Alright, next we have their fourth studio album, a surprise return album from 2017, which is a self-titled record titled Slowdive. A little backstory on how this album came to be. Over the past 2 decades, there has been a resurgence of the shoegaze genre, with a lot of people discovering it for the first time, and others going back and listening to it again with a newfound appreciation. And like I said at the beginning of the video, this has led to a lot of shoegaze bands making return albums in the 2010s after long periods of no music, and that was also the case with Slowdive. So initially, this resurgence culminated with the band reuniting and giving their first performance back in 2014 at a music festival in Spain, and this would eventually lead to a tour and them getting signed to a new record label, which would result in the release of this album in 2017. Now, as far as what I think of this record, I think it is absolutely incredible. I'm going to give this an S. Return albums are always tricky, especially when there is this much time in between records. With this one, it had been 22 years, so I didn't know what to expect going into it, but when I put it on, I was completely blown away, and it far exceeded my expectations. It's got 8 tracks, and from front to back, I think every song is great, and a handful of these songs are really exceptional and would definitely make my top 10 favorite Slowdive song list. I think they did a great job of delivering us songs that sound fresh and fit in with the times that they were recorded in, but also contain those elements that give us those classic Slowdive feelings, but delivering it in more of a modern context. It opens up with Slow Mo, which gives us a nice dreamy and vibey song to bring the album in so nicely. Great production, great combinations of guitars and synth sounds, and beautiful vocal harmonies between Neil and Rachel. Then we change gears with one of the singles, Star Roving, which has a little bit of a brighter and feel-good vibe and is the perfect follow-up to the opener. Then we have my favorite track from this album, titled Don't Know Why. I'm always surprised that not more people talk about this song. I think this is one of the most underrated songs from this album, and also one of the most underrated Slowdive songs in general. Everything about this song is so cool. The drum groove, the beautiful harmonized vocal melody with Rachel doing the lead part, the two-note rhythmic guitar part that complements the drum and vocal parts beautifully, and just the incredibly beautiful and dreamy chorus, which to me brings me right back to Souvlaki and delivers us that classic 90s Slowdive sound, which I love so much. Everything that I love in one track, and then they just keep this incredible momentum going with my second favorite track on here, the other single titled Sugar for the Pill. Another very beautiful track that has a great use of space in the instruments, which allows them to really layer and build the dynamics in a very nice way, and such a pretty and catchy vocal melody against the chord progression. Then we have Everyone Knows, which would be another favorite of mine on here. So unbelievably beautiful. Rachel's vocals are so dreamy. The synth and guitar parts create so much beautiful depth, and the production and instrumentation gives us those classic shoegaze layers that I love so much. Then we have No Longer Making Time, which is another great follow-up track with Neil on lead vocals. Really great use of dynamics from section to section, and another one with such pretty chord progressions and vocal melodies. And for me, the vocal melodies are one of the things that make this album shine so bright. To me, the chorus of this song is just the perfect melody, with Neil doing the lower part and Rachel doing the higher part, which creates such a magical and euphoric sounding vocal combination. After that, we have Go Get It, which changes gears nicely, giving us a more chill vibe. And to me, this one has always given me some hints of Pygmalion, particularly in the guitar parts. And I love that we get a little taste of that post-rocky side of their sound that we hadn't heard since that previous album. And then when the chorus comes in, it just sounds so massive and satisfying. A perfect track to set up the final song of the album, which is Falling Ashes, which is another track that is in a similar style to Pygmalion, I would say. It's an 8-minute piano-centered track that really takes its time and introduces all sorts of layers and textures with really pretty vocal parts, and a very nice and chill way to conclude this incredible album. And I really love how the last two tracks of this album do change gears and give us some more flavors of that spacey, ambient post-rock side of the Slowdive sound. And I think throughout this all, they do a really great job of giving us some flavors from each of the albums that preceded it, but also giving us some stuff that sounds very new and fresh and very much sounds like an album that fits within the time that it was released. So I don't think they could have done a better job with this one. It's got a handful of tracks that would be in my top 10 favorite Slowdive song list, and I would also even go as far as to say that I think this is one of the best return albums that a band has ever made. I really cannot say enough good things about this album. This is my second favorite Slowdive album. This one gets an easy S. Okay, and lastly, we have their fifth and most recent studio album from 2023 titled Everything is Alive, and unfortunately, I'm going to give this one a B. I know I might surprise some people with this score because this album was met with pretty positive reviews, and there are definitely some things that I do enjoy about it, but at the same time, there is a chunk of it that I do find kind of underwhelming, and in the grand scheme of the Slowdive discography, this one would go down as my least favorite Slowdive album, and I was a little bit disappointed with it. For me, when I compare this to the self-titled album from 2017, I think the self-titled album is much more consistent from front to back and contains more exceptional songs and standout moments than I feel like this album does, and I enjoy the choices they made more from a stylistic and production standpoint on that album album compared to this one. This record has 8 songs, all written by Neil, and some of the material on here had originally been conceived as ideas for an electronic solo record that Neil was going to put out. It's very synth heavy, much more than any of their other albums, I would say. And for me, I think this album has a handful of songs that are great, but there's also a handful of tracks that I do find kind of underwhelming and do ultimately take away from the momentum of the album a bit. For example, I think the opening track, Shanty, is very strong, and when I initially put this album on and heard that song, I was fired up and I had really high hopes for it, but then I think following it up with an instrumental track with Prayer Remembered was kind of a weird choice, and with this album only having 8 tracks, I think it would have been more effective to put the instrumental track towards the end rather than this early on in the track listing. I feel like if they opened the album with a couple of vocal bangers, it would have kept the momentum up for more of the first half. I absolutely love track 3 though, which is titled A Life. That would easily be my favorite song on this album. Such a dreamy and ambient song with so many rich textures. But unfortunately after that we have another song I'm not super crazy about with Andalusia Plays. I think it's an okay track, but I wouldn't say it really stands out in the song listing. I really like the song that follows that up though with Kisses. So it's almost like every other song on here I like, which seems to be kind of the way this album plays out for me. I think Skin in the Game is a pretty good song, but I'm also not crazy about Chained to a Cloud. But I do think The Slab is a really solid closing track, and I think ending the album on a higher energy track was a smart move. So I do enjoy about 4 to 5 of the songs on here, but at the same time, I don't know if any of these songs, with the exception of A Life, would make my list of top 10 favorite Slowdive songs. And there are a couple of tracks on here that I do think are a little bit weaker than some of the other stuff that they've put out, and it does take away from the momentum of this album a bit too much for me. And from a stylistic and songwriting perspective, like I said, I do resonate with the 2017 self-titled album much more than this one, but I definitely wouldn't say it's a bad album. It does have some really great moments. Just for me personally, I think this is the weakest record of theirs up to this point, and the one that I do resonate with the least. So an okay album, but not one of their best in my opinion. This one gets a B. Alright, so that is it. Those are my takes on their 5 studio albums. I didn't really think about this until I made this video, but their discography is really interesting, and each album is unique and different from each other in a variety of different ways, and I think this band really offers a wide palette of sounds that can resonate with all different types of music listeners, whether it's the more gothic rock elements of the first album, or the more shoegaze and dream pop elements of Souvlaki and Self-Titled, or some more of the post-rock and ambient elements that we hear in Pygmalion, or some more of the synth-heavy dream pop elements from the newer album. And I would say that of all of the shoegaze bands that I've covered so far for this series, I think Slowdive probably has the most diverse discography of those bands stylistically, and I didn't notice that until I made this video. But a very interesting group with a legacy that will never be forgotten, and a band that is still active to this day, which we are very grateful for, and I am very curious to see if they continue to give us more albums, because even though I wasn't a huge fan of the recent release, it still did have some stuff that I really enjoyed on it, and I think that if this band does continue to perform and write music, I think they still have a lot of great stuff left to give us. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully you learned a thing or two. And if you are interested, please feel free to check out some of my other tier lists, which will be linked in the comments and the descriptions. I've already covered a bunch of shoegaze and dream pop bands up to this point, so I'm sure there's something else that you would be interested in. So please check those out. And like I said, please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 5 albums. Alright, I think that's about it. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you at the next video. Take care.